The sentencing of people found guilty of murder is different from other crimes. And this is to reflect the fact that people found guilty of murder have taken the life of another person, but at the same time they have intended to take that life or intended to cause them really serious harm. People found guilty of murder are therefore given a mandatory life sentence. This doesn't mean that they will necessarily spend the rest of their time in prison, but the judge must impose what's called a minimum term that they must spend in prison. This could be anything from 12 years to a whole life sentence. And the severity of the punishment means that often defendants will attempt to rely on one of the partial defences in order that instead of being found guilty of murder, they're found guilty of voluntary manslaughter instead. The two most common partial defences to murder are loss of control and diminished responsibility. Now, these are defences that can only be used for murder, and they are defences that are raised only when a defendant is charged with murder. And the defendant is hoping in this situation that the jury will accept their partial defence, and instead of finding them guilty of murder, they will either find them guilty of voluntary manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, or voluntary manslaughter on the grounds of loss of control. If a person is found guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, then the judge has discretion, in other words, can choose what type of sentence the defendant can be given. The partial defence of loss of control is used by defendants who've been charged with murder, and they claim that at the point at which they killed the victim, they weren't in control of their actions. They had totally lost it. They say this total loss of control was caused by something that the victim did or said to them, or that the victim was threatening them with some kind of serious violence. They also asked the jury to believe that somebody else in their position would have done exactly the same thing. If the jury believed them, then instead of finding them guilty of murder, they'll be found guilty of voluntary manslaughter on the grounds of loss of control. Defendants who attempt to rely on the partial defence of diminished responsibility are saying that at the time they killed, they weren't in their right mind, that they were suffering from some kind of recognised medical condition that affected their mind and meant that their ability to do something, to understand what they were doing, to control their actions was so severely affected that this is the explanation for why they killed. We said this is a partial defence. The defendant is not attempting to get away with it completely. They're saying my responsibility for the crime wasn't full, it was diminished. And so instead of being found guilty of murder, I should be found guilty of voluntary manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility.